Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Kursk direction, where according to information we have, the Russians launched a full-scale fast lightning counterattack, and as a result of this counterattack, the Russians managed to establish complete control over a significant number of villages. And this is very important, and another important thing that you need to know is that the Russians launched this fast lightning counterattack not in the morning of the 11th of September. The Russians launched this attack not in the evening of the 10th of September. According to information we have, according to pro-Russian sources, this attack the Russians launched 3 days ago. And currently in the morning of the 11th of September and in the evening of the 10th of September, we start receiving updates on all these updates are just the results and the consequences of Russian fast lightning attack that began 3 days ago. And this is very important because, as you can see, the information we are receiving from pro-Russian sources, which means that the Russians did manage to achieve significant results, and we see almost nothing from pro-Ukrainian sources, just some updates from different brigades, from different official channels of different brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine, where they're saying that the situation in the Kursk direction is critical. Now let's talk about this 3 days offensive operation, and there are lots of very interesting updates. First of all, the sources are saying that the Russians, as a result of attack, restored control over the village by the name of Гордеевка, Викторовка, Внезапная, Бяхова, Апанасовка, Вишневка, Komarovka, Krasnooktyabrska, and the most important, over the village by the name of Snagost, which is the biggest village in this direction. But nobody tells for sure how exactly the Russians managed to, let's say, complete this offensive, and lots of people were saying, lots of military experts were saying that the Russians were attacking from the west in the eastern direction. So according to some sources, these arrows that I'm adding on map is approximately the way how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions. But this is not correct, because the Russians began this offensive operation from the village of Koreniva. So the Russians were attacking from the north in the southern direction. So something like this. The Russians entered the village of Snagost. The Russians, by this attack, managed to cut the main supply road, and basically the Russians managed to create a cauldron for the Ukrainians who were located in the village of Krasnooktyabrska, Vishnyovka, Komarovka, Apанасовка. And this morning the Russian sources published the video of this attack, and in this video we can see significant number of armored vehicles and tanks of the armed forces of Russian Federation. This is the episode when the Russians were leaving the village of Koreniva. We can find these tree lines. This is the tree lines we are talking about. So this is the beginning of the video. So the Russians were moving along the street of Snagotsky Shlях in the southern direction towards the village of Snagost. And as you can see, the Russians were using around even more than 10 armored vehicles and personal carriers. At some point the Russians were split in two groups. One of the groups continued moving further in the southern direction, another group moved a little bit in the western direction. So as you can see, the Russians entered the village of Snagost. A lot of episodes of this video were geolocated. Now let's return back to map and we will see how exactly the Russians were moving. So this is the beginning of Russian movement. So this is the beginning of the video. This is the area where the Russians split their group in two, and this is the moment when the Russians entered the village itself, and these geolocations on the territory of Snagost is the area where the Russian personal carriers and vehicles were spotted and discovered. So the Russians entered. As you can see, according to the video, the Russians haven't crossed the river of Snagost, so that's why we have some doubts whether the Russians moved further in the southern direction, but we have reports from different mappers and from different military experts that the Russians launched full-scale offensive operation in this part as well. So as you can see, the Russians, according to different sources, managed to capture significant number of villages, but telling the truth, the Russians haven't captured most of these villages as a result of first attack. The Russians created several cauldrons in this direction, and this is the first cauldron that was created by the Russians between the villages of Komarovka, Vishnyovka, Snagost, and Krasnooktyabrska. We don't know for sure the exact number of Ukrainians that were encircled in this area, but obviously probably 200-300 of soldiers were encircled. Furthermore, additional forces of armed forces of Ukraine were encircled in many cauldrons along the line between the village of Гордеевка, Viktorovka, and Snagost itself. So several groups were split and captured and encircled by the Russians. And during the evening of the 10th of September and the morning of the 11th of September, we also received significant number of videos of how the Russians were moving a lot of Ukrainian prisoners of war who basically decided to surrender when they realized that they were encircled by the Russians. So this is very important of a counteroffensive, fast lightning counteroffensive operation. Of course, now we have questions: what are the next Russian steps? And this is very important question, probably the most important question of the Kursk direction, because I can't tell you for sure that the Russians are planning to continue moving further in the eastern direction with the purpose to cut this foothold completely. The thing is that there are a lots of questions about the operation. For example, some pro-Russian sources continue reporting that the Russians are moving further and that the first Russian squads entered the village of Abukovka. This is basically the results of first 3 days of clashes. But as for the current situation, don't forget that during the previous few weeks we were talking a lot about Ukrainian, let's say, plans to take under control the Sudzhansky region and to take under control Glukhovskoy region, so the territory between the city of Tyotkina and the city of Snagas. And as we can see, either something changed or maybe we don't know something, and let's try to discuss and to understand what kind of information we are missing, and let's try to understand what exactly the Russians are planning to make in the future. First of all these Russian counterattack in Sudzha direction completely connected with the long-range missiles that the Western countries are planning and promising Ukraine to provide, and to authorize Ukraine to use this weapon the deep inside of the territory of Russia. And telling the truth, there is just one reason why the Ukrainians stopped their offensive operation in the Kursk direction on these lines, is that the Western countries in the past didn't authorize Ukraine to use the, let's say, long-range weapon deep inside of Russia. So it was impossible for the Ukrainians to continue moving further without this authorization. And we know that during the next few days, more precisely from the 14th till 16th of September, the Western countries and the United States of America were planning to authorize Ukraine to use this weapon. So Anthony Blinken is going to arrive in Kiev, as you know, and during his visit to Ukraine, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken will tell Kiev that the U.S. will allow the use of the American ATACMS missiles to strike Russia. So this is very important. Furthermore, we have additional updates that apparently the US will cite the supply of Iranian missiles to Russia as official reason for granting Ukraine permission to strike Russia with Western long-range weapons if it is granted. So as you can see, the Ukrainians were about to receive the authorization to attack deep inside of Russia, and that means that the Ukrainians were about to begin the second stage of the full-scale offensive operation deep inside of the territory of Russia. And the Russians know this for sure, and they realize that Ukrainians are going to do this. And the most important, a lot of forces, a lot of brigades and battalions that are currently located in the Sudzha direction have been located here for a very long period of time. And the Ukrainians were keeping all these forces in this direction just with one reason, to get authorization and then to make a rotation, to bring the fresh forces in the Sudzha direction and then to begin full-scale offensive further deep inside of territory of Russia. Maybe also in Glushkovo region, maybe towards the nuclear Russian power plant, the Kursk atom power plant. And the Russians knew this everything, so that's why this attack that the Russians have been conducting for the previous 3 days is not just an attempt to cut these Ukrainian results of Sudzha offensive operation from the Ukrainian side, but also this is an attempt to break the Ukrainian plans to begin the next stage of the full-scale offensive operation in the Kursk direction. So this is also an option, and this is also the thing that might happening right now these days. Of course, let's wait for additional updates. Let's wait for the next Ukrainian steps, what the Ukrainians are planning to do with this situation, because if the Ukrainians are not able to stabilize the Russian breakthrough, most likely the Ukrainians might be encircled by the Russians and might be forced to fall back from the territory of the Kursk region. Let's wait, and obviously we're going to receive answers to this question. Now let's move further, and now let's go to the Pokrovsk and the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. We continue receiving geolocations and updates from the village of Vadiane, the Ukrainians began publishing a lot of updates of how they were FPV droning the Russians in the territory, and this video is another confirmation that the Russians managed to establish complete control over this village. Now let's move to Konstantinovka. According to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions further in the western direction and to take under control additional 3 lines and additional few square kilometers. Furthermore, according to unconfirmed reports, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly between the village of Vadiane and the village of Katerinovka from the south. So these fields were captured by the Russians probably 3 or 4 days ago, and most likely during the next few days we're going to receive final confirmation of this progress. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Ukrainians direction. The Russians, as you can see, according to different mappers, managed to semi-encircle the city of Ukrainsk from the north, and they managed to semi-encircle this city from the south. Furthermore, according to different reports, the Russians entered the city from 3 directions already and managed to improve their positions. What we have some video that was published by Ukrainians. In this video we can see the civilians who were hiding in some building, and the civilians were talking to each other, and they were saying that they managed to spot and they managed to discover the movement of the Russian forces somewhere in this area. Of course, this is not like 100% sure evidence that the Russians managed to reach this line, but obviously this is very interesting. So this is the current configuration of the line of combat contact in Ukrainsk that was confirmed by different mappers, and as you can see, the Russians already control around 10% of the city, and as for the supply roads, the Russians managed to establish operational encirclement, and now the Ukrainians are no longer able to supply and support their forces on the territory of the city from any direction, because the Russians have FPV drone control and of course fire control. There are very heavy clashes in Mikhailovka, and we have additional videos of how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainians on the Russian side already of the village of Mikhailovka, which confirms that Ukrainians most likely managed to cross the railways, and Ukrainians began forcing the Russians to fall back from this part of the village. And in this video we can see another Ukrainian tank that was destroyed as a result of Russian artillery strike or FPV drones. So as you can see, this is the main concentration of both Russian and Ukrainian losses. Now let's move further. We have additional updates from the village of Grodovka. Today some Russian reliable sources reported that the village of Grodovka was completely captured by the Russians. If this information is correct, then most likely the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will provide us additional update about the progress during the upcoming Ministry of Defense report. So, and that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.